Hello again and welcome back to our course on Project 2019. In this section we're going to start to look at resources. Resources include the people involved in a project, they include equipment and materials used, and various other types of resource, notably cost associated with a project. When you look at the Gantt chart, such as this one, you're primarily looking at tasks. The table on the left gives information about the tasks, and the chart on the right gives a graphical representation of the scheduling of the tasks, their durations, dependencies, and so on. Now, tasks and resources are basically the two building blocks of a project in Microsoft Project 2019. And we link the two together using what are called assignments or resource assignments. In this section, we're going to look at resources, and in the next section, we're going to look at resource assignments. One thing you may have noticed when we're using the View tab before is that the first two groups on the left are task views and resource views. And largely speaking, when we're looking at a project, we tend to be looking at tasks or at resources. But there are many views that enable us to look at both at the same time. And in particular, look at the relationship between them. So far, when we've been looking at tasks, we've used the Gantt chart view, which you can see highlighted there in the task views group. And for most people, that's the view that they use most of the time. Of the resource views, a very popular view is resource sheet view, and that's the one that we're going to look at first. So if I click resource sheet, this spreadsheet gives us information about all of the resources in our project. And at the moment, as you can see, we have no resources in our project. Now we're going to start to add some resources in just a moment. But before we do, just look down at the right-hand end of the status bar. You'll see we have some icons. The one on the left is Gantt chart view, and the three on the right, the one that looks most like a spreadsheet, takes us back to the resource sheet. So you'll probably get used to switching between resource sheet and Gantt chart. The other two views, the ones in between, are also used fairly frequently. Task usage, which basically lists tasks and shows which resources are used in a task. And at the moment we have no resources, so there's nothing being used. And the next one is Team Planner view, which can enable us to look at how the work on a project is distributed between a team. Now at the moment we have no team because we have no resources to put into a team. So let's go back to the resource sheet view. The two main projects that I'm using on this course differ in many ways, and perhaps the biggest difference is in the resources that they use and the way that they use those resources. In the case of a wedding, some of the people resources involved, which would be, for example, the bride and groom, won't be charging for their time. And also, the wedding won't involve using lots of consumable materials, not in any case in the way that a building project or a bathroom refit project would. If you think about our bathroom refit project, we have to use materials such as paint and floor tiles and that kind of thing. The difference is going to be even bigger when we start looking at costs, because when it comes to cost, for example, the bride and groom wouldn't expect to charge their time on this project to people, whereas the people working on the bathroom refit will be charging their time to whoever is paying for the bathroom refit. So there are many differences between these two projects in relation to how they handle resources and the associated costs. But I hope that by dealing with two such different projects that we're going to in turn deal with many of the situations that you're likely to come across in future when using Project 2019. Now, as we add resources to the resource sheet, each row on the sheet represents a resource, and each column represents a property of that resource. So the first resource that I'm going to add to this project is the bride. And first of all, I need to say what type of resource is the bride. There are basically three choices: work, material, and cost. And as we're going to see, this is not always a particularly easy choice to make. Generally speaking, people are entered onto the resource sheet as work resources because they do work. And whether or not they charge for that work is a separate matter. but we expect them to perform tasks and complete work rather than, as in the case of, say, materials, be consumed by a job used up in doing a particular task. Or a cost, where we basically say with a task that it has a certain cost but isn't necessarily performed by an individual or involve the consumption of some kind of material. Now we're going to see an example of each of these three resource types, but we're going to work for the moment on the principle that when we add people, we're adding work resources generally. Now when I choose a type for a resource, I will get different accessible selection of properties here. So for instance, when I declare that a particular resource is a work resource, I can specify their standard rate, and at the moment that's $0 per hour, and I can specify their overtime rate. Now, as I mentioned just now, the bride is not going to be charging for her time on this project, so we don't need to assign a standard rate or overtime rate for the bride. We do, however, need to declare how many brides we have. And we only have one, and she's represented by that 100% just here. If I were dealing with, say, bricklayers and I was building a house, I might say I've got 3 bricklayers, so that's 300%. And I could say that the standard rate that it costs me to employ those bricklayers, and then I can also enter an overtime rate. I also have a cost per use. So for example, if I'm dealing with something where there is a setup fee, perhaps a delivery fee or a contract fee, I can specify that here. And I normally also specify an accrual method. Now for the moment, I want you to ignore accrual, and I also want you to ignore the next column, which is the calendar that this particular resource uses, which by default is our standard base calendar. Now we're not looking at calendars at the moment, so just ignore both of those columns. Now, when it comes to using any resource on a project, it's always a good idea to give that resource initials, whereby we can identify that resource, for example, on the Gantt chart. So for bride, I'm literally just going to put bride for the initials. So that's my first resource set up. Now, it would only seem right to add the groom as my second resource. So let's add him in here as well. And we'll stick with the same initials and just call him groom. So now my project has 2 resources. The next resource I'm going to set up is a little bit controversial. I'm not really sure you do it in this way, but you certainly could do it this way. I'm going to add a resource of wedding ring, and I'm going to say that this is a material resource. So let's jump back onto the resource sheet and add wedding ring. And I'm going to select material, and I'm going to give it the initials of ring. And note that when I chose material, some of the other fields, some of the other properties also changed. So for instance, max was cleared out. It no longer said 100%, which is the default for a work resource, because we're not talking about having a maximum number of rings. We can basically buy as many rings as we want, subject to available funds, of course. And similarly, the standard rate changed from being dollars per hour to just dollars, because we're not talking about a rate of pay for somebody for a work resource. We're talking about the cost of a material. When you're dealing with costs for materials, you also declare what units the cost refers to. So if instead of wedding rings I was dealing with building bricks, and what I might put here in the material column might well be 1,000 for 1,000 bricks. Now for the price of a ring, it will be price per ring, and let's suppose the price I'm working on here is 500. And that is all the information I need to set up that material resource. So at whatever point I decide to buy one or more wedding rings in my project, the cost will be recorded in the project as $500 per ring. Now for an example of a cost resource. Sometimes a person working on a project is not really working on it as though they were, say, a builder, or in this case, the bride or groom. What they are doing is more of, if you like, a service. So I might choose to make the photographer or videographer for this project a service or a cost to the project. We're not talking about paying this person by the hour. We're talking about their standard charge for photography or video at a wedding. So in this case, I'm going to add the resource photographer. And I'm not going to deal with the photographer as though he or she is a person working on the project, but deal with them as a service to the project, a cost to the project. So on this occasion, I'm going to make the type cost. The initials I'm going to apply are photo. Now you notice that there is no highlighted cost rate field with dollars, as we had before for work or material resources. And in fact, the best way to record the cost of a cost resource in a particular situation is to assign that cost when you assign the resource to the task. And I'm going to show you how to do that a little bit later on. At the moment, the important thing is that we have listed our cost resource here, photographer. And of course, with this project, there will be many other cost resources. It is true to say in this particular case that many of the resources, so things like the wedding dress and even wedding ring, might reasonably be considered to be costs rather than materials. But as I said earlier on in this section, sometimes it's actually quite a difficult decision to make, and you'll certainly find that you have your own approach to determining which is the best way of dealing with resources on your own projects. Having set up a few resources there, we're going to do a little bit of resource assignment in the next section. But there's one more thing to show you in this section. If I select one of the resources, and note that we do have a resource tab, one of the options on the resource tab is information. And that brings up the resource information dialog box. As with the task information dialog, you have a number of tabs running across the top, and it's already got in it the information that we've entered so far. But of course, there's other information that you can add, some of which we'll be looking at a little later on in the course. Now, there are other ways of getting to this resource information. You can right-click and you have an information option in the menu. And of course, you can just double-click on the resource to bring up the same dialog as well. So that's it for resources for the moment. I will see you in the next section.